Cask of Amontillado. It's one of my favorite stories to read, one of my favorite stories to share and to talk about. And it's a lot of fun to do research on this story too. But today I wanted to talk in particular about characterization in the Cask of Amontillado. Before I get to the actual story, I'm going to take just a minute to reflect on Poe and his body of work and his importance in the American literary landscape. Edgar Allan Poe is known as a master of suspense, also known as the grandfather of Gothic. His work laid the path for a whole body, a whole genre of work in which death, destruction, suspense, and horror reign, which sounds bad, but it actually can be a lot of fun if you're reading about it. He's known for creating characters who demonstrate really twisted psychology, and he is a master of using vivid imagery of death, decay, and scary stuff to activate your imagination and draw you into this very grotesque world, which is typical of the Gothics. He's also known for his use of implication. Poe was conscientious about every single word in every single sentence, so he claimed, and so his work seems to say. On a personal note, he had a very tragic life. A lot of people close to him throughout his life died from tuberculosis or other causes. And that certainly had an impact on the way that he viewed the world in such a dark and tragic manner. So in particular, thinking about the Cask of Amontillado, let's first think about our protagonist, Montresor. So you would think that a protagonist, many people think a protagonist is the good guy, but that is not the case in this story, or so it doesn't appear. A protagonist does not always mean the hero or someone that you would want to emulate. The protagonist, it really means the person, the character that you mostly follow or whose story is the most crucial in their development, most crucial to the theme of the story. And Montresor in this case, even though he commits an atrocity, is definitely the protagonist of the story. So let's think for just a moment what we know about Montresor and how we know it. We know that he is from an ancient and aggressive family line. He lives in this huge palazzo that's perched above a catacombs that is of his entire family line. That shows that his family has been in that place for a long, long time. They have thousands of years of Montresors recorded and collected underneath the home. And so that says something about sort of the ancient nature of their family line. Also, if you think about their family motto and their family coat of arms, you can see it depicted here. No one punishes me with impunity, meaning that if you come at us, we're going to be coming right back at you. You will not harm us or damage our family without feeling our wrath in return, which is also illustrated in the coat of arms, a foot stepping on a serpent, which in turn is biting the serpent. It's difficult, in fact, impossible to deduce who exactly would be the Montresor in that situation. Both parties are inflicting injury and both parties could potentially be damaged or destroyed. So that kind of gives a glimpse at his family line, which he illustrates many of those attributes. He's also methodical. We see at the very beginning of the story, he outlines his entire ethical and philosophical and moral code in a very short amount of time. He sets up these rules for how he's going to inflict punishment for someone who is Fortunato, who he perceives to have wronged him, insulted him. And he says he's going to let me see, how does he say it? He's going to punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong unredressed when a wrong is unredressed when its retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. So right there in the very beginning of the whole thing, he set up his methodology. He's got to punish the person who has wronged him. He can't himself suffer consequences for inflicting that punishment. And also the person who he's punishing has to know who's doing the punishing, has to know that it's Montresor who is bringing down the wrath. And so he lays out his methodology, his moral methodology at the very beginning. And throughout the story, we see lots of evidence of him setting up Fortunato, both psychologically and in the fact that he's got all this preparedness in the catacombs when he leads him down there. Everything from, having the tools in place to carry out his heinous deed, to sending away the staff in his house. All these things are in place. And he clearly knows Fortunato to be able to manipulate him the way he does, to appeal to his vanity and to lure him down into the catacombs. So we know that he's adept at manipulation. We also know that he is likely Catholic. The fact that he is of an ancient line in probably somewhere in Europe would hint at his Catholicism, but there's also his frequent use of Latin terms. As we know, Latin is kind of the language of the ancient Catholic Church. And so those clues would lead you to believe that he's Catholic, not to mention the fact that at the very beginning, he speaks to someone who we never exactly find out who that person, the you that he's speaking to is, but he says, "You who so well know the nature of my soul," using that Christian language as well. We know that he's masterful in his use of language and ambiguity. Throughout the story, he uses dramatic irony. He talks to Fortunato and says things that we as the reader who know what he's about find to be very ominous, but Fortunato has no idea. We see that several times throughout the story. At one point, Fortunato says he's sick, he's coughing. He says, "I certainly won't die of a cough." And Montresor is like, true. And we know as the readers who are in on his scheme that he says this because he has other ideas in mind. Fortunato has no idea. And that use of ironic language is pervasive throughout their dialogue. And then also in his final statement, if we look at the very end of the story, we find in the very last two sentences of the story that he seems to be giving a deathbed confession. He tells this whole story that recounts the entire story of committing this murder. And then in the last two sentences, for the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed those bones. May he rest in peace. So we find out that we're reading this story and hearing about this story 50 years after it's actually occurred. And so it's a deathbed confession, and yet many aspects of this confession do not seem at all repentant. So it's ambiguous as to how he actually feels about his participation in this atrocity and whether he actually believes that he is sorry for what he's done. Also, as the protagonist, Montresor provides our narrative voice. And so that's going to be important to think about as we consider other aspects of the story. Everything we see in this world is through the eyes of Montresor. Okay, our secondary character is Fortunato. And in this case, even though Fortunato is the victim and not the victimizer, he is the antagonist. So an antagonist is not necessarily a bad guy. An antagonist is the person or the character who comes into the world of the protagonist and causes a disruption. For the very first line of the story, we find out that in Montresor's mind, in Montresor's world, Fortunato is the intruder. 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I'd borne as best I could. So Fortunato comes into Montresor's world and causes an upheaval, and then is the focus of Montresor's vengeance as he spends the story kind of leading him to his demise. So he's the intruder, he is the antagonist. He's ironically named Fortunato. You would think fortunate, but this man seems very unfortunate in this story. However, if we think about what led up to his demise, in some ways he has been fortunate in his life. He's acknowledged as a powerful, important person. He seems to be wealthy. And so those things would seem fortunate. However, again, ironically, getting walled up in a catacombs and left to die buried alive is not a fortunate end. So in some ways, that's an ironic name. We know that he's vain and prideful. One of the methods that Montresor uses to entice Fortunato into his catacombs is to appeal to his sense of vanity. He says, "I found this amazing rare wine Amontillado, and I went ahead and bought it, even though I should have talked to you first because you know everything about wine, but I went ahead and bought it I know you're busy, so I'm going to go and talk to Lucrezia about this because he's almost as good as you at figuring wines out. And Fortunato's like, what? That guy is a quack. Lucrezia doesn't know Amontillado from sherry. I know. I'll come down to your crypt and I will help you decide if you have made a good choice. I can't believe you got this Amontillado. So he's vain and prideful, and Montresor knows this and capitalizes on this personal character flaw in order to manipulate him and control him and have him go along with his plan. It's likely that Fortunato is a Freemason. There's that odd interchange between Montresor and Fortunato where Fortunato makes a wild gesture and Montresor is like, what are you doing? And he says, oh, you're not one of us. You're not one of the Brotherhood. And Montresor is still confused. It's like, what? And Fortunato says, of the Masons, and he tries to do the secret handshake. So if you know anything about the Freemasons, this is going to set him up as someone who's kind of the new world, not of the old world. The old world would be sort of committed to the Catholic Church and the ways of the Catholic Church. The Freemasons would be constructing their own world and their own moral code and their own sort of set of rituals. And so he's set up as sort of the new world character in conflict with Montresor, who is of the ancient world. This is reinforced when Fortunato is talking in the crypt with Montresor, and they're talking about all of the wine and all that stuff. And Montresor says, he uses a phrase that really sort of sets him apart. Actually, it's when Montresor is describing Fortunato at the very beginning. He says, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack, but in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. So the fact that Montresor sees Fortunato as like his countrymen, not like our countrymen, is again evidence that these two men are from different worlds. Montresor is from the old world, Fortunato is from the new world. Fortunato is physically and mentally weak. He's easily manipulated. He's got this cough. He's very drunk, makes him an easy victim, an easy target. He challenges the protagonist in that he has caused him to go into all these machinations in order to create this huge elaborate plan to cause his downfall, and has apparently been on Montresor's mind for his entire life since then, considering that 50 years later, this is the thing that he chooses to confess on his deathbed. It's important to remember, though, that Fortunato, even though he's depicted as somewhat of a fool in some ways, he is completely visible to us through the eyes of Montresor, who hates Fortunato. So anything that we see in Fortunato is through the lens of Montresor, and that's important to remember. For all we know, Fortunato could be very different from the way Montresor sees him. Along those lines, the main method of characterization in this story is indirect characterization, very little direct characterization. So indirect characterization is when you have to decipher the character through how they act, what they say, if you get a chance to see their inner thoughts, the way other characters react to them, and their looks, the way they're described. So those are indirect methods of characterization. Direct characterization would be where a narrator tells you how to interpret a character. And because we have an unreliable narrator, you can't really rely on any of the direct characterization. So for example, if Montresor says, Fortunato is a fool, well, that can't exactly count as direct characterization because Montresor is an unreliable narrator. We just don't know if that's true or not. The indirect characterization is also evident through the consistent use of ironic language. So we're getting this ironic language from Montresor. We know he is a man of reality versus truth, that he is not forthcoming. He speaks in double speak almost throughout the entire story. And then there is, of course, the narrative framework, which is problematic in terms of thinking about this direct characterization. The story is told as a deathbed confession likely to a priest. And so the filter that Montresor is going to put on his words is for that audience. So, that's something to think about. How much can we count on the reliability of his story when we know, first of all, he's a man who speaks in doublespeak. He's a man who's confessing and hoping to get an atonement. And so those things are going to color the way that he sees the world and the way he speaks about the world. And all of those things lend to the ambiguous and compelling. I mean, the ambiguity is part of what makes this story so compelling. We never know the truth of the situation, the capital T truth of the situation, because it's all from Montresor's point of view, and everything that we know about this world, we have to kind of put through that filter of this is how Montresor sees it. And what we know of Montresor is also very limited. So for example, we know that Fortunato has injured Montresor 1,000 times and has insulted him to the point where Montresor feels justified in walling him up in his catacombs under his house. But we never know what that exact injury, the nature of that injury was. We just don't know. And so this leaves a lot of room for speculation, and it's kind of what makes the story so fascinating. So if we think about what this story is really about, it's about a lot of things. It's about revenge. It's about atonement. It's about moral ambiguity. For example, is perhaps in some way, shape, or form Montresor justified in what he's done? Lots of critics have written works about the possibility that Montresor sees himself as a foot soldier of his family, defending the honor of his family. And if that's the case, that would very much skew the way that you read what he does. There's a lot about disguise. There's disguise of language. Fortunato is wearing a getup from Carnival. It's during Carnival season when Montresor pulls Fortunato from the upper world of light and festivity into the downward catacombs, dark catacombs. He says he puts on a mask. He puts on a mask. I think they describe it as a black mask before walking through the crowd to bring him home. So there's all this disguise evident in the story as well. But with all of the layers of indirect characterization and ironic language, and even the fact of the way that Montresor carries out his plan, I would think that the story seems to be about the idea that what people perceive to be true is limited, and failing to recognize these limitations can lead to a downfall. So if you think about how that is apparent through characterization, of course, there are direct events. Fortunato perceives the truth to be that Montresor is his trusted friend who values his opinion, that they're good friends. And then that because of that, he's taken advantage of and led to his death. That ironic use of language where the words that Montresor speaks on one level to Fortunato would appear to be true and sincere, we as readers know to be the opposite of that. And so the perception of that language is limited and does lead to Fortunato's downfall. There's that moral question of repentance. So, I mean, one of the things to think about, Montresor says that he must punish with impunity. He has to punish Fortunato, but yet not suffer the consequences of his action. And so the story raises that question. But at the end, if he's confessing in order to escape punishment or being sent to hell for the murder that he's committed, one component of confession is that the confessor feels contrite. And so there's that limited perception on Montresor's part as well. You could argue that if you're going to get into a theological debate, that even if he confesses, if he's not repentant in his heart, then he's still going to suffer a downfall, a spiritual downfall upon his death. So there's that as well. The character limitations, Fortunato does not see the full picture. His perception is extremely limited. And so that kind of underscores this idea. And then, of course, we as readers have severe limitations because of the fact that we're seeing everything through the eyes of an unreliable narrator. And key facts and key details are held from us. So all of these things limit the perceptions that we have of the story. And also all of the characters in the story have limited perception as well. And for the characters in the story, it leads to a downfall, although hopefully for us as readers, there's no downfall to be had. So that's just a quick thought about how you can discuss character in terms of central idea, and a quick thought on some of the aspects of this story that are really interesting and compelling and fun to talk about. So all that being said, I guess when we talk about stories we don't really look for a moral, but I guess if there was one, it would be don't trust people who drink a lot of wine, and never go with people alone into the catacombs. Right on.